thank her for her mentorship through this. I also do want to give a content warning. This presentation will be using language that is highly gendered. That's not in any way to say that I necessarily condone the gender binary, but rather to reflect the gendered social environment that we all live in. I will also be discussing gendered violence, as well as violence against the land and the significant climate crisis. There will be images that do depict graphic language and minor sexual content. If any of these topics are a potential trigger for you, I encourage you to please do what is necessary to keep yourself safe, whether that's closing the presentation and seeking out further mental health help. I want to begin my presentation by talking about Tyler. If you grew up in Alberta, you probably have some idea of who Tyler is. Young man, mid-20s to late 30s, maybe he's married with kids, maybe he isn't. His profile picture probably looks something like this. But my point going into this talk that I really want to emphasize is that it's really easy to create a caricature of people and to reduce individuals to the most absurd norms of a group and write them off as individuals. But I want to frame the beginning of this presentation by reminding everyone that these are real people, and as I talk about social structures, it becomes very easy to lose sight of that. But I want to remember that these are real people, and that these patriarchal structures that I will be talking about harm all of them as well. What is an intersectional gender-based analysis of climate change? This has kind of been floating through the literature lately of how do we start to incorporate intersectionality into our understandings of climate change and our analysis. In order to do so, we need an expansive analytical lens in order to achieve this. And so we must address how institutions of gender influence not only the production of greenhouse gas emissions, but also the strategies developed and employed to mitigate emissions, the distributions of impacts, and the systems of knowledge through which each of these processes is identified and understood. And there has been some previous work on this gendered spectrum, and they focus mostly on the differences in vulnerability between men and women. It's very empirical work. I want to move beyond this largely empirical work to look at the gendered sociocultural institutions that support fossil fuel development, and by extension, create resistance to climate change mitigation with significant political effect. So incorporating this feminist critical analysis into issues of the environment is by no means a novel concept. I'm definitely not the first person to do it, nor will I be the last. Feminist scholars have, for example, offered insightful critiques of the production and applications of Western science, including in the realm of environmental management. Ecofeminists, more specifically, have offered unique critique of both human domination and the domination of nature that extend beyond these gender-based discriminations to sort of encompass oppression along racial and class divides and the intricate ways in which these human categories have been associated with the natural world to justify their continued domination. And since its inception, many ecofeminist theorists have provided powerful critiques of modern Western culture, capitalism, colonialism, and male-centered epistemologies. There's an emerging field of scholarship on the gender dimensions of energy systems, more specifically. And while much of this work doesn't necessarily deal with climate change explicitly, there are important implications for this work as it relates to gender-based climate change studies, especially when we consider the central role that the energy sector plays in producing greenhouse gas emissions. So for starters, some empirical researchers have drawn attention to women's limited access to energy and their limited representation in the energy workforce and decision-making. There's also a small but still super relevant set of papers that explicitly apply a feminist studies lens to energy systems, including, and this is what I will be really focusing on here, studies that have begun to examine the intersections between masculinity and energy production. More relatedly, these scholars attempt to make the connections between how masculinity as an identity is often intimately tied to ongoing extractive processes, whereby these identities are informed by ongoing energy practices, and threats to such extractive processes are perceived as threats to personal identity. So I intend to build off of this work on masculinity and energy and further illustrate how fossil fuel-based economic sectors, which pose among the most formidable of political constraints to effective climate change mitigation, are deeply entangled with a masculine identity. And therefore, this confrontation with fossil fuel interests in climate policy may in fact be seen as an attack on this masculine identity, and therefore may meet significant resistance to climate mitigation as efforts are made to sort of preserve and protect this masculine identity. Now we'll draw selectively from masculinity studies to illustrate the interlinkages between masculinity and fossil fuel extraction. I'll explore how these interlinkages manifest in the Albertan context, and I hope to highlight throughout this presentation that so long as masculinity maintains a strong foothold in the cultural psyche, fossil fuels will continue to sustain energy dominance and a social acceptability. Definitions are super important, and for these particular terms, we've heard, I'm sure, numerous approaches to them. When I refer to masculinity, I refer to a performed set of culturally defined attributes, practices that kind of have come to be associated with and expected of men, and often as a means of differentiating or distancing themselves from women. Masculinity, at least in the Western context, is heavily situated within the gender binary of Western culture, and this sort of false assumption of there only being two genders. Patriarchy, as I will refer to it, is a system of oppression against femininity. Many folks kind of just make this assumption that patriarchy is oppression against women, but this fails to acknowledge two things. The first is that it is oppressive to many folks that do not identify as women, including men and trans women, trans men, my apologies, as well as it fails to acknowledge the various identities, including different ethnicities and different norms that are, that are rewarded and oppressed as well. My slides have decided that they're going to start moving on their own. My apologies, folks. So masculinities, once again, are socially constructed. There wasn't much early conceptual work done on masculinities. Most theorizing on mankind was exactly that, mankind. And it was really the work of second-wave feminists and their challenges of essentialism and fundamentalism that has actually changed this. And because masculinity is informed by social context, it means that there is a multitudinous representations of masculinity that are just as varied as social contexts. If you're in sociology, you understand that there are infinite number of social contexts, and they're all shaped by time, place, geography, you name it. Masculinity does not exist in isolation of social behavior. As I said, it truly is created in social behavior. So in this way, the context becomes so important to how these masculinities are manifested. Yes, we have a ton of masculinities that could potentially come to fruition, but not all of them are treated one and the same. So masculinity in the Western context, once again, is situated in a gender order that defines masculinity in opposition to femininity. So sort of these power relations between men and women as groups, at least as Western culture sees it. So this creates a need to differentiate or distance one masculinity from femininity, and kind of creates this hierarchy of masculinity with those that are more distinct from femininity, the manly men, kind of at the top, and those with more ambiguity situated lower. There is a preference for different masculinities in different contexts. The rejection of masculinities in other contexts kind of make clear these masculinity hierarchies. And the form of masculinity that is dominant in any given social context is referred to as hegemonic masculinity. And the use of hegemonic emphasizes the cultural authority that this hegemonic masculinity has, while acknowledging that all the other masculinities just coexist alongside it, or below it, as it were. Hegemonic form of masculinity is not always the most common. It represents rather this prioritized or elevated status in this gender politics. It also represents the privilege that men, particularly those who embody this hegemonic masculinity, have over others. And so, in other words, this hierarchy of masculinity is an expression of the unequal dispersion of male privilege among different groups of men. As I said, social context is so important, and just to kind of illustrate this a little better for you folks, this will be a little more relevant to those from Canada and familiar with these cities, but what we would see as a hegemonic masculine in Vancouver, Edmonton, and Ottawa will still be different. Like, yes, they are all part of Canada, and therefore they share similar cultural elements, but their contexts are still so different, and therefore we're going to see these hegemonic masculinities manifesting in very different ways. But they're similar in a broader sense, and therefore would be more common than, say, like a masculinity in a village in China, but they would still be unique to one another. Somewhat obvious, but not all men will feel powerful. This really has been kind of used as a means in which to sort of invalidate claims of hegemonic masculinity. Kimmel does a really good job of illustrating a double hierarchy to kind of visualize how these power structures operate. So on one hand, you have the power of men over women, this masculine over feminine as groups. And on the other hand, you have power of men over other men based on their class, race, and ethnicity. And a large part of scholarship theorizes from this first hierarchy, this men over women hierarchy. And this is probably in large part due to the fact that most of this theorizing comes out of feminist studies, which is really from that perspective of largely women theorists. But on the other hand, men on a personal level tend to dwell more on this second hierarchy and feel frustrated, understandably, when they're not experiencing these feelings of power that they are criticized for having. So alongside with traditional understandings of masculinity, this can inform a sense within men, particularly white men, that they should feel powerful, that in some way they're even entitled to feel powerful. After all, they're being criticized for being powerful. Why do they not feel it? And this entitlement to feel powerful is central to much of the work done with abusive and violent men, as violence is often a means through which individuals feel that they can restore what is rightfully theirs, power and respect. So considering this connection between a masculine sense of entitlement and violence is particularly important as we explore the more toxic manifestations of masculinity. So as I just said, toxic masculinity is where violence is used to maintain this hegemony. Once under threat, the potential for the hegemonic masculine identity become toxic increases significantly. It's a really common term, but frequently it's used very ambiguously. But it really refers to sort of this hegemonic masculine under threat, or at least a perceived power imbalance. The familiar characteristics, rage, suppression of emotions, and empathy for others, as well as inadequate communication styles. Not all masculinity is toxic. The very qualifier of the term toxic suggests there are indeed many non-toxic forms. Certain men will feel compelled to seek this hegemonic masculinity more than others, and these individuals will perceive threats to their efforts to do so and respond to those threats in different ways. And understanding how this toxic masculinity manifests and how a perceived threat to hegemony may be responsible for such toxic outbursts is important in understanding the connections between masculinity and fossil fuel industry. Ecofeminists have kind of made the claim that patriarchy equates and denigrates both women in the natural world. So the social construction of nature is implicit in and inseparable from the social construction of gender. So on one hand, we have the feminization of environmental concern, which can be particularly obvious in these rural extractive landscapes. These expressions of concern for the environment and the individuals expressing such concern are feminized and thus to be opposed by individuals who sort of embrace this masculine identity of energy extraction. Secondly, to the extent in which environmental concern is accommodated, such issues are usually approached from this lens of control over and utilization of the natural world, so through basically the masculinized tools of science and technology. Eco-modernism is perhaps the best example of this. We see its proud flag bearers, Bjorn Lomborg, or even more popular Elon Musk. Eco-modernists claim that there is no inherent conflict between the environment and the economy, and it truly holds that technological solutions generated through this private free market can actually solve any challenges that are going to arise. This idea has been kind of explored through the role of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Oh, my slides are going to be challenging here. Sorry about that, folks. The former government of California. So his more traditional industrial era masculinities were really embodied by his powerlifting and machismo days. And it's kind of traded in for this hybrid masculinity of, Governor Schwarzenegger of California, champion of green technologies, and driver of the greenwashed Hummer. I don't know if you've ever heard of this electric Hummer, but I highly recommend you look it up. It's probably one of the most absurd things I've ever seen in the world. But this new masculinity created by eco-modernists like Governor Schwarzenegger created the space for compassion and care, these feminized ideals, to coexist along traditional masculine traits like toughness. However, this compassion still remained secondary to techno-rationality and economic growth. So while the door was open to consider these more feminine traits, like, oh, maybe we shouldn't destroy the environment that we all rely on to survive, the decision-making process still remained asymmetric priorities. Like, we still need to ensure our economy flourishes above all else. It could be said for Elon Musk. I also encourage you to look into some critiques of him. They've raised pretty much the exact same points and probably a little more relevant to modern times. So masculinity, finally, or traditional gendered social structures more generally, is highly compatible with conservative political ideologies that are increasingly being linked to climate skepticism and resistance to environmental regulation. A consistent body of empirical research has identified these strong associations between climate skepticism and sort of this conservative white male identity, which leads us into between conservative political ideology and the furthering of this eco-modern masculinity. Unlike eco-modernism, petro-masculinity makes no attempt to appear concerned about the well-being of others of the planet. Once again, as most masculinities in Western culture, it sees femininity and masculinity in direct conflict with one another. The agents of petromasculinity lash out when they feel that their hegemonic power is threatened, so when their fossil fuel industry is threatened. And it does not seek hegemony through techno-scientific utopia, such as eco-modernism would. Rather, it seeks to defend the current petrocultures and the industrial masculine from those that seek to undermine this absolute power. And so this petromasculinity, I'm arguing, could be a key source of the defense of the sector's status, just as people try to defend this industrial petromasculinity and sort of the potent conservative symbols that it represents. So the intersectional impacts of extractive activities are extensive. However, instead of ignoring climate change, racism, gender inequality, or remaining inactive as most people tend to, petromasculinity is very reactionary and actively denies these realities. And this denial is viewed as kind of a welcome reprieve from the guilt and uncertainty and despair that usually follows in the face of conversations about global warming. Those are not fun conversations to be having. But by simply narrowing the scope of beings that matter to white men and prioritizing their comfort and well-being alone, the issues caused by fossil fuel violence cease to be problems at all. So in this way, we kind of see how it's operationalized to eliminate problems by simply eliminating those whose problems matter. The denial of these intersectional impacts, as I said, is very prevalent, but especially in environmental politics, particularly in climate change debates. There's a high representation of women in environmental justice movements, and these women often cite their children or grandchildren's well-being as a reason for their involvement. Meanwhile, many men, even if they don't necessarily subscribe to this petromasculine ideal, their masculine identities as workers and economic providers within these industries that are under scrutiny still makes their involvement very complicated. So women as mothers and caregivers, again, have been really effective in mobilizing support for environmental movements. But fossil fuel companies and other destructive industries have really noted the effectiveness of such narratives and have tried to work with this sort of gender discursive frame and turn it around by sort of reframing it as jobs versus the environment in order to appeal less so to this feminine care, oh, think about our children, and more towards this sort of male worker concept of the breadwinner. You see the concept of the hysterical woman trope kind of enacted to sort of invalidate these feminine concerns about environmental justice largely. And there has even been instances where public slander campaigns have been undertaken in order to really silence and invalidate female activists. And many of these campaigns have really leaned on a lot of problematic assumptions about women, a lot of really violent stereotypes. So now we move into masculine petrocultures at work in Alberta. This is our next case study. Images of Alberta are pretty standard. You have these rugged mountains behind the expansive fields of grain, the ever-presence of the oil industry. We see the occupations that create these sort of images, you know, the stoic rancher, the grain farmer, the rig worker, muddy steel-toed boots, always usually a hat, whether that be a cowboy hat, hard hat, the heavy equipment required to really control this land, whether that be the giant diesel pickup trucks or your house-sized dump trucks that they use up in the oil sands. These images all serve to sort of inform the Alberta dream. Similar to its American counterpart, the Albertan dream simply requires that an individual rolls up their sleeves and puts in a hard day's work to succeed. It's very much built on this idea of meritocracy. And for much of the first two decades since the discovery of Leduc-1, thanks to record high oil prices, this dream has been an achievable reality for virtually any able-bodied man that enters the oil and gas industry. From highly skilled trades individuals to completely inexperienced laborers, the wages of the Alberta energy sector have been inflated beyond their counterparts in any other sector. Thanks to educational policies from Premier Ralph Klein, students don't even have to take all of their classes in high school. Rather, they can just take a handful of the classes of their peers and then put the rest of their time into their apprenticeship hours. Thereby, within a matter of years of graduating, they'll be making journeyman wages, which are quite generous. And of course, this environment is highly masculinized, and despite industry-backed programs to encourage more women to pursue these higher paid positions, women have been slow to enter these positions. And so a quarter of oil and gas sector workers are women, but over 90% of tradespeople and equipment operators, these high-paid positions, are male. And women are typically employed more so in the lower-paid feminized spaces, such as company offices, administrative tasks, in some cases also serving, taking care of that care work, such as food in camps and such. And the growth in wages across the province historically allowed for this higher tax revenue and large infrastructure investments. And there's widespread pride in the way in which Alberta has improved through this hard work and its energy economics. This pride has also, though, been accompanied by sort of this desire to kind of redefine the province from a place on the fringe of the global economy to one that was more central to it. I love this quote from Ralph Klein when he was the mayor of Calgary, as I think it really embodies sort of this acknowledgement that what Alberta was seen as was not necessarily desirable, but kind of trying to dance with this line of how you actually made the money, which is exactly this greedy, vulgar, hard-drinking, cigar-chewing, cowboy capitalist oil man, with something more metropolitan as Calgary was trying to reinvent itself. And of course, the drops in oil prices in 2014 really disrupted this system of easy money, and jobs in the oil industry have been disappearing ever since that point. And so while the jobs themselves have been disappearing and a lot of people are hurting, the PETRO masculinity that has become so central to the Albertan identity is not as easily going to be going away. Probably the best place to start when we're looking at this PETRO masculinity in Alberta is man camps. Usually in a remote location, usually fenced in, accessed by some god-awful, hard-packed road, or in some cases it's so remote that it's flying. But these man camps are really instrumental in remote resource extraction, as they house these large transient worker populations that otherwise the area would not be able to sustain. And the emphasis is on the fact that they're temporary. It's not like this is permanent infrastructure that has come to a region that might benefit remote small community. It's truly temporary. This is a completely self-contained camp. It's not meant to create a sense of community. The term man camp itself is even reflective of who the camp is designed to serve, which is these white male extraction workers. As a female that has stayed in them, I can definitely attest to the fact that there's not very many women in it. But the few that are bodies that are employed to sort of fulfill the reproductive roles in the camp. So serving the food, doing all the cleaning, taking care of the administrative check-in and check-out processes. But the homogeneity of residents within these man camps make them a petri dish for sort of this toxic hegemonic masculinity that I talked about earlier. The petromasculine ideals are strongly enforced. Most of the guys in there are working in the oil industry. There's a constant rotation of new workers required. And because of this constant rotation, there's this continued need to prove hegemony. And regardless of the origins, workers are immersed in sort of this social context. And it's difficult to resist this social context, at least if you want to be accepted and face less sort of tension in the social setting. There are numerous interrelated outcomes of this masculinized social space, but with limited space, I'm just going to highlight two of them, which is dysfunctional social behaviors and a highly masculinized conservative provincial politics. So for dysfunctional social behaviors, the isolation and toxic environment that really is fed by these man camps and sort of the extractive process leads to significant stress for workers. The stress, the loneliness, physical injury, even grief over sort of the destruction that you're taking part in every day are all potential signs of weakness that must be concealed in this hyper-masculinized social space. Thus, it's really not that surprising that a lot of workers need to engage in activities that really help them in some way, shape, or form blow off steam. This model of temporary mobile labor is also facilitative of these behaviors, and given the nature of their lives within any remote community, fossil fuel workers often based in man camps far from small rural communities in which they actually spend their after hours are disconnected from these communities. They have no connection to or reciprocity with these communities, and likewise, the social norms that these communities may otherwise have used to sanction such damaging behavior. We see significantly higher rates of alcohol use in the oil industry than we do in any other industry in Alberta. And though it's hard to get a grasp on numbers, I think it could be easy to say that this is just an industry-wide thing. It's just a reflection of the industry. But I want to highlight that men in the oil industry are at high risk for alcohol abuse, while women are at low risk. So there's this very interesting sort of gendered differentiation between how people are grappling with these very masculine social spaces. Some in more healthy ways and some in less in terms of substance abuse. And even worse, these dysfunctional behaviors intersecting with this hyper-masculinized culture must alienate itself from femininity to gain hegemony, extends this towards the treatment of women. So the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women reported the observable increases in crime levels, sexual offenses, and domestic and gang violence in resource development contexts And these linkages between resource extraction and violence against Indigenous women really illustrates the colonial ways of knowing that are inherent to this fossil fuel industry and this petromasculinity. In general, Indigenous women in Canada are at a greater risk of violence than non-Indigenous women. They're 6 times more likely to be victims of homicide and 3 times more likely to be victims of domestic violence than non-Indigenous women. And the rates of violence are even higher for those living in remote communities that have this high industry presence and therefore this high proportion of transient male workers, which leads us into the masculine conservative politics that is also fed by this petromasculinity. Once again, this image of the working class, natural resource hewing male is truly idealized by petromasculinity. And so oil workers and the politicians who seek their political support express this sense of entitlement to their continued petrocultures and its accoutrements. The readily available high-income jobs, resulting high tax revenue that allows Alberta to remain the only province in Canada without a PST, provincial sales tax, and an extreme form of trickle-down economics that relies on spending by high-income resource extraction workers to facilitate this broader economic prosperity. So trickle-down economics overseen by essentially white male extractive workers. In 2018, Trudeau got flack for this comment at the G20 summit in Argentina. He acknowledged the gender impacts that construction workers have for large infrastructure projects. And this comment is empirically accurate. There are impacts and they do need to be addressed. But what is particularly interesting is the response from the political petro-fundamentalists in Alberta, such as the Alberta Conservative Party leader, Jason Kenney, who snapped back with, Justin Trudeau says pipelines must go through a gender-based analysis because male construction workers have impacts. Darned right they do. They build things, create wealth, pay taxes, take care of their families, but this trust fund millionaire thinks they can't be trusted. This is like an absolute attempt to sort of diminish the empirical evidence that has been presented against petrocultures. And here's where we really see this masculinity trying to defend itself against any concerns raised, anything that threatens its hegemony. We see more of this petromasculine politics in this red tape campaign by the current government, which emphasizes that it will cut any and all red tape to save time, create jobs, or reduce costs. Of course, this has actually just resulted in form of policies that support environmental regulation or climate mitigation being completely annexed, being cast down as red tape. What image better captures, again, this intersection between patriarchal domination, violence, the fossil fuel industry, and feminized environmental activism than this absolutely horrendous image that was spread by an energy company in Red Deer, Alberta, about the underage climate activist Greta. This was met with significant disgust, but the fact that this image was even conceptualized is, I think, very reflective of the way in which the vilification of female environmental activists is undertaken. At the same time that these provincial elected officials are standing up for the jobs of extraction workers in this time of economic downturn, they've pursued these steep public sector cuts to education and healthcare that are also the sectors which happen to employ a disproportionate number of women in a province in which women are already disenfranchised in the labor market. So this is a quote from the Women's Centre of Calgary based off of the National Census from 2016, which found that women in Alberta face the largest unemployment gender gap of any province, are overrepresented in lower paying and minimum wage jobs, and experience poverty at greater rates than men. There's also this, as much as this success in the energy industry is kind of insinuated to be gender neutral. It's not. Women are excluded in so many other ways, even though the opportunities are promoted as potentially being gender neutral. They don't actually work out in that way, largely due to unpredictable schedules, long hours. This really only works for people with few personal commitments, or people who have someone in their lives able to sort of take on those personal commitments. Unfortunately, because we live in Western society and we still adhere in many ways to traditional gender norms, men are really excused from a lot of these personal commitments in order to pursue these jobs far away from their family. But women face significantly more social pressures in doing so, and have fewer means in which to kind of move around these limitations. And so really, once women have children, they either have to exit or avoid the industry altogether, or take lower paying jobs in offices, versus men who are kind of praised for sacrificing their time with their family in favor of bettering their family financially. Finally, this political sphere exhibits its own toxic masculinity in the form of this normalization of or outright hostility towards women, particularly those in leadership roles, as we definitely saw with Rachel Notley when she was premier. She was the most threatened premier of Albertan history, and one particularly important example, I think, of just how violent her situation was in January of 2017. Her office was informed by the Canada Purple Shield, which is an insurance company that specializes in pre-planned funerals, that a funeral home had received a completed application in her name for her own funeral, which is incomprehensibly violent to me, and very reflective of this normalization of this violence against women. These are just a few pictures of campaign signs. I'm sure any of us living in Edmonton at the time had fortunate experience of seeing one or two of these. So just kind of give you masculinity in summary. Gender roles in Western culture adhere to this strongly polarized gender binary. Normally, these concepts of femininity and masculinity can really exist entirely without any kind of hierarchy. But again, Western culture puts this binary on them. Patriarchy operates within this gender binary, and kind of pits masculinity and femininity in opposition to one another, situating masculinity over femininity. And it prioritizes this masculinity and devalues the practices, views, and identities that are associated with the feminine, and thereby kind of ensure this continued power and control. So while feminine ideals may be given a head nod by some masculinities, such as eco-modernism, that's operating within the same structure, these elements will remain in a place of deference, secondary to the more familiar masculine ideals such as meritocracy, technology, control. And because Western patriarchy, the system that produced petromasculinity, presumes this unavoidable friction between masculinity and femininity, it's really established the scenario where this feminized nature must also conflict with masculinity. And so either the masculine identity bests nature through either its destruction or in kind of the eco-modernist sense, through sort of this paternal mastery of it, or nature will best masculinity, and perhaps this will occur through natural disasters, inclement weather, viruses, you name it, that will dismantle the global systems that have come to define modernity and the success of masculinity. Some eco-modernists have claimed that they've been able to remedy the two worlds. However, as I've already discussed, there's still this really unequal valuation of masculine versus feminine traits here. So, hegemonic petromasculinity offers a formidable source of underlying support to petroleum industry. These threats to petroleum industries are thus received as threats to that masculinity, and responded to in a requisite manner. These defenders lash out against perceived enemies in defense of the industry, but also of their masculine identities by feminizing those perceived enemies, aiming to reestablish a sense of control once again. Petroleum industry advocates have become staunchly opposed to environmental and climate policies while continually reaffirming their support for fossil fuels, even in the face of the growing reality that to do so is acutely harmful to the environment, the climate, and even to the regional economy, as we're seeing in the case of Alberta. Any policies that may be viewed as restrictive to extraction are dismissed as costly luxuries, and environment or climate activists, many of which are women, are dismissed as enemies of Alberta, or betting against Alberta, if you like that new advertisement that's been going around on the radio. Returning then to this assumption that either masculinity or nature must master the other, such a perspective becomes really reminiscent of a lot of far-right and nationalist rhetoric that assumes only one can win. Approaching the climate crisis from such a perspective really silences a lot of constructive debate, and instead presents to Albertans and Canadians this really false choice of supporting either the climate or supporting the economy. And so it's either this future of petro-masculine prosperity or a future of disempowerment and poverty. This is the choice that is really presented by this ideology, and this really misleads one towards a false conclusion in favor of these sort of neoliberal ideals. In such a social landscape where oil and gas extraction has produced significant wealth, but is now under threat from increasing pressure to address environmental and climate impacts, the defensive posturing of Alberta's petro-masculine identity is on full display. So through the celebration of the working class, petro-masculinity acts as this proud rallying cry for like the male breadwinner that, I don't know, wrests raw resources from the earth, in contradistinction to like the low carbon rhetoric that permeates much of Canadian and international politics that would have these oil and gas workers retrained and employed elsewhere. And this petro-masculine identity has become sufficiently hegemonic to be idealized well beyond the confines of these man camps and industrial facilities. Instead, this identity is broadly embraced within Alberta culture, to the extent that expressing at least some support for it becomes a necessary game that any provincial political leaders must play in order to gain electoral support. Lots of work for petro-masculinity to be maintained in Alberta, especially when faced with sort of the economic and environmental threats. Once again, the political discourse in Alberta sort of insinuates this gender neutrality. Substantial government support of the oil and gas industry and its male-dominated workforce during the current period of economic decline has coincided with catastrophic cuts to education, healthcare, and other public sectors that have all had a disproportionate effect on working women. And the complete lack of political support for working women by this current administration, such as cuts to the affordable child care program, perpetuates essentialized ideas of femininity and drives wealthy, mostly white women back to their roles as homebound wives and mothers, and confines working class women to lives of poverty, juggling expensive child care, and alienated from their children. Petro-masculinity belies the enormous challenge that extraction workers face, exposed to all manners of elements in full PPE and maintaining demanding work schedules that often take them away from their families for weeks at a time. These workers are expected to just man up and not complain. And the inability to be transparent about the obvious challenges that they're facing being in such unforgiving environments creates the necessary conditions for a host of toxic outcomes, such as drug and alcohol abuse, domestic abuse, and rape culture. As pressure grows to mitigate climate change, this animosity and violence becomes directed towards climate change advocates, and the outcome to an explosive situation regionally with global repercussions, as these extractive zones become powerful nodes of resistance in international efforts to combat climate change, manifesting in strong oppositions to even modest proposals for mitigative strategies such as carbon taxes. This is a really, really useful map. I think it indicates what many of us probably could have guessed, but when we look at the distribution of even individuals who think the world is getting warmer, it's pretty distinct, the difference that you see in Alberta and resource extractive zones in southern Saskatchewan as well. So what? Why do we care? Progress in climate change mitigation requires confronting and dismantling the gendered structures that have served to buttress the fossil fuel industry. It begins foremost with simply the acknowledgement that petromasculinity is deeply entrenched as a social identity, and as with all identities, it will not be readily shed by its adherents. This is particularly the case given that this identity is hegemonic within these extractive cultures, and thus, again, to relinquish this petromasculinity is to relinquish that power that comes with it. The second step is a deeper questioning of certain truisms in Western culture that prioritizes things like economic growth over human ecological well-being, and idealizing of these masculine over feminine traits. Where do we go from here? Feminist utopia? As unsustainable as the hegemonic masculinities in Western culture may be, it doesn't mean that there's no place for a masculine identity in the climate change debate. There are examples of masculinities, however marginalized they may be, that exist in antagonism to this anti-nature masculine. Ecological masculinity is one of these examples. It values practices such as the localization of economies and the creation of small-scale technologies and the decentralization of renewable energy, or decentralized renewable energy systems, my apologies. And it prioritizes this kind of cohabitation with nature in everyday life. And so while only one such example of the multitude of masculinities that meaningfully align with climate change goals, we hope that the embracing of ecological masculinities by actors and groups such as 350.org and Men Engage serves as inspiration for how masculinities may be reimagined and reclaimed to align with the pressing need for action. This is not just about the need for action on climate change goals, although this is very pressing, but it highlights the need for a new hegemonic masculinity, one which moves beyond the patriarchal binary of men and women and instead engages with ecological values and empathetic processes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angeline. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much for your talk. That was very interesting. I liked it a lot. I think now we are going to move for comments and questions. So in order for this to work in this environment, I'd like you to really well, you can take and open up your mic. However, you should really say at the end of your intervention that you are finished, okay? So that we can turn it back to Angeline if she wishes to return and give feedback or comment or respond to the questions. But then you need to say, well, I'm done. Okay, so that we can, after Angeline has responded, we can turn to another questions. Thank you very much. You may start asking if you want. You may also type a message if you need to ask a question.
I'll jump in. This is Deborah, just because there's a moment of silence. So great job, Angeline. That was really well put together and a lot of just really, big difficult issues, and you did a great job of integrating them. So my question is a pragmatic one. So you made a very compelling case that climate skepticism in Alberta and defense of the fossil fuel industry is really rooted, at least in part, in this defense of masculine identities. So if we accept that to be true, then how can that inform our discourse in terms of our attempts to to have a conversation with these fossil fuel defenders, assuming that, you know, the kind of the usual tropes that support renewable energy aren't going to be effective here. So what are your ideas?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your question. I think, in one hand, if we accept what I've just said as true, it complicates the conversation significantly. The approach most broadly taken, I think, to climate change debates has been, well, people just need more information. So I think it operates to, first off, debunk this idea that we need just more information, we need better data, and then people will realize that, you know, this is in fact a crisis and we need to respond to it. But it also brings up the challenge of changes to identity are incredibly challenging to facilitate. People are very resistant to changes in identity. And I'm trying to recall a lot of what we've read on identity change, but what is coming to mind is you have to take a much more nuanced approach, as anything that's seen as an attack, which in this case might be, you know, this dismissal of fossil fuel industries, needs to be reevaluated, and instead maybe take a more conversational approach and really encourage individuals to start re-examining issues from maybe a position that doesn't feel as antagonistic and challenging to how they define themselves. So I know that's probably not very solutions oriented, but I mean, truly anything that comes down to identity is so difficult to address. And so if this is in fact true, that presents an even larger challenge moving forward for climate activism. Thank you.
Any other question? Other questions? Actually, I have a question.
Perfect.
Can I ask? So, Angeline, I was really interested by your talk, and actually, you start by talking about masculinity. You were very careful about how you describe it. Then you say, well, some form of masculinities are toxic, others form are not toxic, and then you turn to you specialize a little bit your concept, and you turn to PETRO masculinity, which you argue is toxic. Mm-hmm. My impression is, I think this is true. I mean, I would tend to agree with that, but my impression is that with the oil crisis and the fact that oil prices are likely to remain extremely low, I would tend to think that this type of, let's call it toxic masculinity, as you did. Okay, this type of masculinity is gonna have either, I mean, these people are gonna have to adapt, or it's gonna have to disappear in a sense. What can you say about that? What's your feeling?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I think that's where it becomes relevant to turn to the political side of Alberta. I also think oil prices are going to remain very low. Unfortunately, our current government does not, and I think it's reflective of just the extent of that entrenchment of petromasculinity in sort of the Alberta psyche. Is by most metrics, we should move beyond it and adapt into a new economy, into a new way of doing things. But you know, you're seeing this government with enough political support that it's been able to continue to perpetuate this idea of like, well, no, oil jobs they're coming back and they're going to be our savior, and we need to save the jobs of the oil workers because they're all out of work, which again completely ignores the fact that all the cuts that they're doing in order to do that are largely affecting women. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you. It should, by every standard, disappear, but we're seeing the evidence that it is very reluctant to, again, sort of give up that hegemonic state. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions?
This is Henry. I have a question.
Yep.
Hi, Angeline. Thanks for your talk. I think I understood like 15% of it, but that's about par for the course for these seminars. The question I have is, so, I mean, living in Edmonton in Alberta, it's, you know, no matter what profession you're in or what job, you'll still have friends or people that you know working in the oil sector. And so, you know, I have friends like that, and we talk and we get into a lot of arguments and disagreements. But the one thing that I sort of sense from them is that there's this sort of underlying fear, like a genuine fear, that things won't get better. That despite all the, you know, boisterous proclamations of the government and whomever, that they just deep down worry that things will never get better, and that Alberta will become like, you know, West Virginia or Missouri or the Appalachian and what the coal industry has become. And so some of these sort of toxic behaviors or sort of these pronouncements or what the government says, how much of that is driven by just a truly strong sense of underlying fear that the lives that they had, they'll never get back again? Whether that's good for the rest of society or not, I mean, most people are pretty, you know, when things are bad, they really just care about themselves. So how much of that is just like fear? And that's the end of my question.
Thank you for that, Henry. I would agree with you insofar as there is, I think, this underlying fear for sure. And I would, based off of what I've just gone through, I would attribute some of that fear towards losing hegemony and kind of the hegemonic power. I mean, if you're fearful that the oil industry isn't coming back, why is there not this enthusiastic uptake of an alternative? I mean, the NDP promoted, and I don't mean to be getting partisan. I'm trying to just more so illustrate how these processes operate. But I mean, the NDP were advocating for diversification of the economy, for a solution, I guess you could say, to this fear. But the broad political response to that was a no. It was a resounding no. It was no, we're going to go with this guy who says he's going to bring back this oil industry, despite, I mean, you're, you know, as an economist, I'm sure you're aware of, you know, many of the economic indicators that would say that's a bad bet. So we're trying to really explore this idea of like, okay, well, even in the face of this this information that indicates that isn't where you should be placing your faith, it is in fact still where people are placing their faith. So why are they doing so? And so we are articulating that it is in fact like an identity thing. They identify themselves as oil workers, that's who they are. That's why they're turning to or returning to, I guess you could say, hope in this oil industry to save them.
Isn't it just simple politics?
In what?
The government might really believe that oil is never coming back, but if they say that, they're going to lose. And they only care about winning the next election.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yes, I mean, I would be afraid to lose. I mean, everybody wants to stay the king if they are the king or the queen, right? So that's fine. And the government, I mean, no matter how many stupid things they say, I don't truly believe that they're stupid. But I think that they're savvy. And so maybe what they're doing is the savvy thing and not the economically optimal thing, because their objective function is to get reelected.
I mean, but if we're gonna go down this road, there's political talk and then there's political action. And so, I mean, any government can say that they're going to bring the oil industry back and they care about oil. And in fact, I think if you want to win in Alberta, you absolutely have to say that you care about oil and that you want to support the oil industry. but your actions are reflective of where you're sort of looking. So I mean, the UCP, for example, cut numerous programs and opportunities for economic diversification in favor of sort of promoting their friends in the oil industry. I mean, that's not a trickle-down effect that we're seeing. There's not more jobs in the oil industry because there was tax cuts. That was kind of like a PETRO fundamentalist approach taken. So why are we not seeing their support from their key supporters, sort of that 35% that will always vote UCP in Alberta? Why are we not seeing them reacting to that? If they are coming from a place of fear where they want a job, why are they not reacting to this fact of like, well, I'm not getting a job? I'm not sure if that necessarily got at your question. And the politics of Alberta are multitudinous and diverse, but I would still highlight that there's clearly something underlying when the evidence indicates you should do something else and you're not. Ooh. Thank you. I see there is a comment. I'm just reading.
Well, Dennis. Dennis, can't you talk? Dennis? Where are you? I can't unmute it.
That's okay. I think I can. Oh, his mic isn't working. That's okay. I think I can still respond to this.
Okay.
I think the argument towards that, Dennis, would be that the current system as it is, and this petroculture system, is designed in a way that these with this toxic masculinity can maintain their power. As I illustrated, it's really hard for women to access these high-paying jobs. So really in the Albertan context, if you want to make easy, good money, the oil industry has been that answer for a lot of men for a very long time. Versus this green economy, it's really centralizing equality. So a lot of groups that have been very disenfranchised from economic opportunities are being given a fair shot in the green economy. And I think there's a lot of folks who look at that and realize that if we have this transition, then what has made me powerful and economically advantaged disappears. In a green economy that, prioritizes work-life balance, where having children doesn't impact women's ability to access good jobs, that starts to shift how these men interact in their everyday world and how powerful they are in that. Plus, it also just, it contradicts their identity as an oil worker. At the end of the day, they see themselves as an oil worker. And so that's really what I'm trying to get at in this presentation is once you're confronting an identity instead of an idea, it becomes much harder to convince change. And I hope that answered your question.
Thank you, Dennis.
Hi, Angeline. This is Andrea. I have a quick question.
Hi, Andrea.
Really enjoyed your talk. I'm so excited to hear the progress you're making. You briefly mentioned retraining in the renewables industry, and I just wanted to hear your perspective on the feminization of renewables and if you think that that's been a barrier to actually retraining oil and gas workers in that sector. Thanks.
Thank you for your question. I am not super familiar. There's some really amazing feminist energy scholars that have focused exclusively on this topic. I am not one of them. I will attempt to do justice to what they've said, but I just want to be clear that I am not super familiar with their work. But I would still, I think it's kind of a twofold issue of, again, it's that identity. They see themselves as oil workers. They're not very interested in an alternative to being an oil worker. And then additionally, yeah, I mean, some of these guys who've worked in a masculine dominated environment their entire lives, where you can say really, I mean, I had a supervisor who called me darling, despite like my dismay at that name, and he faced no repercussions because there's a team of 26 guys and I'm the only female. And so for that guy to enter then a balance, like a gender balanced space or even a female dominated space where he's going to be called out for that behavior, he feels attacked instead of reflecting on, well, maybe there's some problematic norms I've learned in my years of, you know, being just absolutely immersed in this petromasculine culture. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
Thanks,
I
Edward.
have a quick question if you don't mind, Angeline.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thanks, Sonic.
Yeah, great presentation. Thank you very much for delivering it. Really insightful and enlightening. I'm sorry if this is a little out of scope, but I'm curious about how you think or you've seen in your research petromasculinity and aspects of gender relate to the almost side industry, but very related to the extraction industry, the components of decommissioning and reclamation work that are happening and will definitely need to happen in the future to deal with the physical impacts of extraction. That's another question. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question, Sonic. That is an issue really near and dear to my heart, just because that's what I did in the oil industry, and I think it's the gendered elements are really apparent in the decommissioning and reclamation language. Right now, it is still very much informed by sort of these masculine ideals, as opposed to maybe like a more care-focused approach of right now with reclamation, instead of returning to the land to what it was before, we simply have to reclaim it to equivalent function, which means that instead of making a wetland in this beautiful boreal fen that was there before, which we quite frankly can't recreate as in reclamation yet, we don't have the technology, you can just put a compensation lake and then nuke the hillside with fertilizer. We're really there's this really weird rhetoric that about reclamation that seems to insinuate that we're doing it and it's fine, but I mean these reclamation sites are not even remotely equivalent to what was there before, and yeah, and I think it's very informative of how we are currently approaching reclamation with sort of this dominant petromasculinity, as opposed to, you know, there's been a lot more of this kind of care centered lens that's been lent by particularly a lot of Indigenous leaders have really kind of advocated for sort of a different approach and mentality towards reclamation. Like right now, we really think, oh, well, we can just destroy anything and we'll figure out, we'll trust our technology will be there one day to fix it, versus kind of a more risk adverse, valuing what's already there kind of approach. I hope that answered your question. That was kind of convoluted, but.
That was great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonak. Any other questions? We still have time.
So one I might ask, inspired by Sonic. Hi, Angeline. Good.
Hi.
Really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
Awesome work. Yeah, just talking about reclamation. I'm curious if in your work you've seen gender trends in other sort of resource industries, or what sort of your take is around that. So is this something that's just solely in petrocultures, or do you see this in, you know, forestry or mining or fishing, or have you looked at any of that or come across anything like that doing some of this background and developing this kind of model and argument and thesis? Thanks. End of question.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, so my approach has been really informed by ecofeminist scholarship, which basically looks at any and all resource extraction as kind of coming from similar patriarchal norms. So in a broader sense, you could kind of refer to, they call it like the industrial masculine, and there's a whole world of it, but it really comes down to sort of this gendered binary in Western culture, and again, how these particular traits have been assigned sort of gendered characteristics, and then how we've then oriented it. So I think the best way I can explain it quickly would be to come back to sort of eco-modernism that claims to have dealt with both these masculine and feminine traits, but really at the end of the day, these masculine traits still kind of sit in dominance of these sort of feminine care-centered traits. Like, we still value economic growth over, you know, health and safety and of the next, you know, 7 generations. So really, I mean, it's such a hippie thing to say, but I mean, really, capitalism is really reflective of this industrial masculine, and I think petro masculinity is really just like one component of it. The reason that we focused on it is, I mean, fossil fuels really do represent one of the biggest hurdles to climate change mitigation, which is why we really wanted to address, well, okay, well, what is happening here that is maybe preventing action taken on fossil fuel economies, and so therefore that's why we focused on petromasculinity. But I mean, you can see similar trends in many industry discourses. Thank you.
Any other questions? Other questions? Okay. If there are no other questions, I would like to thank again Angeline for this wonderful seminar. Everyone is clapping their hands. Angeline, you cannot hear them, but
thank you.
So that was a great experience. Actually, it turned out actually quite well. And I think if everyone is very patient and disciplined, we can do a really good seminar. It's not as good as in-person seminar for sure, but it is quite good. So I want to remind everyone that next week there was a seminar in experimental economics by Christian Vossler. Christian Vossler has wanted to come in person. Obviously, he cannot because we don't do that right now, as you know. So he has canceled his seminar. I mean, he said he's postponed it. So hopefully he will come back next semester. So I would like to encourage every one of you to you know, you just send me an email if you want to present your research. As you see, it turns out to be quite simple, and it works well. So please, if you want to, especially the student, if you want to present your research, and maybe you don't need 1 hour and a half, you just need 1 hour, just send me an email and we will set up your presentation. Thank you very much, Angeline, again. And,
thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for everyone for attending. Bye, everyone.